Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jamin Shively. This is my father, John Shively.
Hello.
And the next issue we're going to address is that of climate change, and that's rapidly going to fork into some other major issues. So this is just a very high level, think of it like a stone skipping on the water.
I'm going to stop a minute.
Yeah. What's up?
It just occurred to me that something that you've done, that your hands, look at the screen.
Yeah.
Your hands are
Oh,
flying
okay.
all over the place.
Thank you, Dad.
You were constantly doing.
No, I got you. So we're recording now. Let's just continue. But that's really good feedback. I just wanted you to know we're recording.
Yeah, are you deducting that?
No, because this is good feedback for me, and that's actually a really good example of constructive feedback, right? So thank you for modeling that for me and for all of us. Okay,
Moving on.
So climate change, the fundamental issue I see, here's the context for me around climate change, is that 97% of climate scientists agree that human activity is adversely affecting the climate with disastrous implications for our planet. What's the degree of disaster? That's debated, it's discussed, but 97% agree that it is negatively impacting our planet and the sustainability of life on Earth, et cetera, et cetera. I may be overstating it. Pardon me if I am, but we'll get the exact quotes. Or somebody please send us a link. Put a link in the YouTube comments as to what the best quotes are, the best summary of all this is, because that's lacking here. That's missing. But anyway, in light of all that, in light of all the data and the evidence that we have that climate change is extremely destructive, as a planet, we're not taking the steps that we need to take to mitigate that, to stop climate change, or even to reverse climate change. And the question is why? What's the problem? Here we are on this kind of runaway train of climate change, irreversible climate change. And, the conductor of the train is just stepping on the throttle and full speed ahead. If anything, we're accelerating. Actually, carbon emissions are actually increasing. They need to be decreasing. It would be one thing if they were flat, but they're increasing, right? So the problem is accelerating at a pretty alarming rate, and the climate scientists are just tearing out their hair. What part of crisis don't you understand? And I don't think the problem is that people don't get it. People get it. It's just that I think we're barking up the wrong tree in terms of how we're going about solving the problem, which is lobbying our governments to take action. The fundamental problem with that I see is that elected officials are, rule number one for elected officials is get reelected so that you can keep doing the good things that you're doing, or whatever you're doing, right? Rule number one is get reelected. And if taking the bull by the horns for around climate change, ultimately it's pretty clear reducing emissions is essential to halting climate change, or even having any hope of reversing it. And reducing emissions, essentially, a lot of these politicians equate that with putting the brakes on the economy. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, but in their minds there's a significant risk. At a minimum, there's a certain significant risk, if not certainty, that would, in their minds, certainty, though they're mistaken, that would derail the economy, right? Throw us into recession or worse. And so I don't think that elected officials are the ideal group to go after, to say, hey, take this baton and run it through the finish line as fast as you can.
No, don't put them all in the same.
No, certainly not. I'm just saying, as a group, as humanity is basically, when we're protesting, like, a couple weeks back on the big climate protests that were the largest that had ever occurred on Earth, what are they protesting? They're lobbying the government. They're protesting the governments of the world, or the United Nations, or whoever, and saying, hey, take action, right? But again, I think that's barking up the wrong tree. Not that we shouldn't lobby the governments of the world. We should obviously continue to do that very vigorously, very intelligently. But in addition to that, we should complement that with with a plan to actually bring about the reversal of climate change that'll actually work. that'll work politically, that'll work for the industries of the world, though many of them will transform significantly. But ultimately, that will work, that will take into consideration the needs of everyone, and that will actually be implementable and roll outable, and then we can we can leverage the media and PR to generate the meme that we do have a plan for reversing climate change. That's actually at the heart of the strategy, which is to create a whole new narrative around climate change. The current narrative is, oh my goodness, it's a disaster, and we're headed towards disaster, and we need to put the brakes on emissions.
And it's out of control.
And it's out of control. That narrative is a very bad news narrative, right? It's a very, very bleak narrative. Now,
but to a lot of competent scientists, it's very true.
Oh, Dad, I believe in the narrative, right? So I'm sold. I'm so sold that I'm, going to be dedicating a lot of my time to this issue. But what I'm saying is, for your average Joe, right? For your average Joe and your average Jane, that's a very bad news narrative. It's just, it's so pessimistic, and they will tend to grasp for something that will give them some relief from that very negative scenario. They don't want to imagine a world where their children and grandchildren are suffering, and there's war, resource wars, and mass starvation, even at a greater scale than exists today, et cetera, et cetera. So if you give them a branch to grasp onto and say, you know what, it's really not that big of a deal, or it's actually not caused by humans, it's this natural cyclical thing, and we're just kind of going through these cycles, and just kind of bear with it. Most of them will grasp onto that branch. The elected officials who they represent know that, and they exploit that to their advantage to get reelected by echoing that. I mean, why do you think there's 167 members of Congress who are climate change deniers, right? That's a very big number. It's a very scary number. But again, I think that we're barking up the wrong tree when we just put our efforts on lobbying the governments of the world. There's a different way. What's that different way? We need to come up with as an operating system for reversing climate change, which is really an operating system for the whole global economy. We need to create an operating system for the global economy. And that operating system needs to have as its bedrock, I argue that operating system needs to have as its bedrock foundation, compassion. Compassion for people, compassion for ecosystems, compassion for future generations, ensuring that we have a sustainable world that will be inhabitable by humans on roughly the magnitude that we are today, right?
Well, there's two treatments. Either you can stop it or you can slow it.
Or you can reverse it.
Or you can reverse it. And there's a solid body of competent scientists that says reversibility is impossible. Stopping it may be impossible. The only thing we're left to do is to slow it.
Interesting. So I'd like to get those very scientists onto video conferences on this topic on Spectral Radio, so that
very good.
Let's so as I know you consume a lot of the news, some really interesting news that you consume through the radio, through KPFA and through Amy Goodman's program. As you hear about these different experts who have a unique perspective and are not afraid of getting up in the media and sharing their views, and they're articulate, or even if they're not articulate, please note their names so I can reach out to them and invite them to this, to a future conversation on this topic.
And there's another class of people who are looking short term for profit.
Right.
And with no regard for consequences to the population as a whole.
Yeah.
Only to satisfy their immediate personal desires.
It's interesting. I mean, I hear the words that you're saying, and a certain picture forms in my mind of of the CEO or chairman of one of these giant oil companies, right? And but I think that's kind of a straw man. I think these are human beings too. They have families too. Many of them have children and grandchildren, and so they.
In other words, they're susceptible to reason and logic.
Yeah. I believe they are. I believe that every human is susceptible to reason and
There's a
logic.
correlation with education. Trying to educate these people is to your point of view, is the stumbling block, because they have very well lodged in their minds their goals. It's very self-serving.
Well, here's the interesting thing, Dad. Keep in mind that with spectral radius, what we're creating here, will evolve to become a higher form of intelligence, and its intelligence will increase as some monotonic increasing function of the number of members and the level of participation and commitment of the members. And I believe that higher form of intelligence will collectively, it's really all the people working on it, but it's also the tools and the technology. Put it all together and I call it a higher form of intelligence. That higher form of intelligence collectively will have the power to come up with a narrative and, say a 5-minute video, right, that really sums it up in very powerful terms. And if there are questions remaining in the viewer's mind of what they just saw, and the undeniability of climate change and what an urgent issue this is for our planet, you provide them with links to answer their questions, frequently asked questions. Well, isn't it true that it's just cyclical?
Yeah.
Right, that's a frequent, well, great, let's click here and then, have a 10-minute video that discusses the cyclical nature of climate and how this is way out of the bounds of cyclicality. And this has a whole different driver than the normal cyclicality that we'd be observing.
What will the percentage of the people who are responsible for the problem be viewing the information that you're describing?
Exactly. So here, well, I've got kind of two answers to that question. One is that the higher form of intelligence that spectral radius constitutes will create a narrative that is an optimal narrative for the entire planet, including those who are responsible, right? So for the optimal approach that spectral radius develops may not be, hey, let's point the finger at you, you are responsible, you must pay. That may not be a message that's very appetizing to those people, right? Or to the elected officials that they have influence with.
Or one other level, those who are responsible but don't bother to ever hear your message.
Correct. Yeah. But here's the thing. See, within spectral radius, we'll be able to develop not only the ideal message, but the best, distribution channels for getting that message to all the people in the world, not just one given, segment. Though we may use segmentation and different means to get to different people, we probably will. But the point is that it become a global meme.
Okay.
Right, and that it be a narrative which, and I want, it's not without trepidation that I say the following, but in many ways the narrative needs to be much more of a good news narrative than a bad news narrative, because good news, people will open up their minds and hearts and take it in. Bad news, they tend to repel and look for alternatives, whether it's Ray Kurzweil saying, "Oh, technology will solve it," right? Or whether it's Fox News saying, "Oh,
Look at some of the politicians we have in Congress right now, and at the top of the heap.
Yeah,
and they are stonewalling.
Well, let me give you a perfect example. I mean, a dear friend of mine, U.S. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who represents Orange County, he does not share my view on climate change by any stretch, and he thinks it's greatly overblown and all that kind of stuff. And so, one big litmus test for me is when Dana starts to look at this differently, right? I'll know that we've made taken some serious ground, anyway, but.
When will that start with him?
Well, I've already started the conversation, and I think I'd like to talk with with Nathan Mervold about it, anyway. And there's other folks I want to follow up with on this topic. But to the extent possible, let's have these conversations right here on Spectral Radius, because again, here's my plug: conversations worth having are conversations worth sharing with the world. Let's not be greedy or stingy
Okay.
about our conversations. Let's share them. So the point being, through this medium, we'll be able to figure out the messaging, the narrative, the delivery vehicles to get it to all the people who need to hear it. We're going to essentially going to be leveraging network orchestration technology to orchestrate an international conversation, finally, ultimately a global movement with tremendous power that the whole world gets on board with. And to what end? What is it that we want to achieve? Well, we want for our Uber objective is that the world be a very different place from what it currently is, and that it be on a much more stable, safe trajectory into the future, where everyone is on board, everyone is taken care of. There is, no starvation, certainly not at anywhere near the scale that we see it today. How do we get to that ideal state? Well, first of all, we may never get to the exact ideal state, but it may be, asymptotically increasing, and then we get closer and closer. But but as an essential component to that, we do need to have an aim. We do need to have a well-defined ideal state. This is what we're aiming towards. It's kind of like, shoot for the stars to hit the moon kind of thing. So, what is that ideal state? Well, that's a whole conversation we need to have. And, please look for a topic that'll have a name, something like, the ideal state of planet Earth and humanity, or something like that, right? So we need to define that. Now, and I noticed you pointing at your watch, Dad, but here's the thing. This is really central. This is really core. So I'm not going to rush through the next 5 minutes or so. So just bear with me. We need to articulate what that ideal state is. That's a huge conversation, right? That's a fascinating conversation where we basically say, what if we were starting with a clean slate? I know we're not, but what if we were starting with a clean slate? The clean slate being the world exactly as it is today, with exactly the infrastructure and industries and factories and farms and tractors, and all the assets that exist today, all the people that exist today. But imagine that, everything were centrally owned by some, benevolent higher form of intelligence, such as what we're creating here. I'm not suggesting we turn over ownership to us, but go ahead.
It's not just politicians, but it's the economists that you need to bring on board.
We need to bring on board experts from all disciplines, because the problems that we're tackling here, including climate change and eradicating hunger, they're engineering problems, they're marketing problems, they're political science problems, they're peace and conflict studies problems, like the great Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at UC Berkeley. They're negotiation problems, hence bring in the Harvard Negotiation Project. Right? They're computer science problems, they're atmospheric science problems, they're psychology problems. So we need all these disciplines to come together so that we can transform all of these problems in a holistic way. It's the ultimate project for humanity. It's literally about saving much of humanity, if not all of humanity, from if not destruction, physical destruction, certainly destruction of the spirit, knowing that we have the capability to transform these issues, but we're not. But anyway, back to the ideal scenario. So there's this ideal state for planet Earth that we need to define. Once we define it, we need to determine kind of the optimal trajectory, or the optimal glide path, if you will. How do we get from where we are, exactly where we are today, right? With all the trade imbalances and deficits and debt and national debt and runaway train and with exactly where we are today, with all the momentum and acceleration that we have in whatever directions, and how do we go from that rich current state, which we now have tremendous data on like never before? What's the optimal glide path to the ideal state? How do we get there as quickly and safely as possible?
You have to look at the Current trend, this, the second degree.
Yeah.
And it's progressing at a bad negative rate right now. How are you going to arrest that?
Yeah.
And
Right. See, that's all part of the Uber challenge that I just articulated, which is going to take spectral radius to resolve, because it's going to take experts, academics, professors, researchers from all over the world, and all these different disciplines that we just named.
Politicians.
And politicians, absolutely. Everyone. It's going to take all of us participating in this conversation to transform it. And I call that creating a higher form of intelligence, and I certainly hope I don't kick anyone to the curb of the first stage of acceptance in calling it that, but that's what it is, I believe. That's what we're creating here. That higher form of intelligence is what will transform even the seemingly most intractable problems on planet Earth. Seemingly intractable, because I don't believe any of them are intractable. And we're going to prove that here on Spectral Radius in the coming months.
Okay.
So in order to do this mapping and create this glide path from current state to future state, what we really need is a general model for the entire planet, including all of its economies, at the level of detail of all of its industries, sectors, companies, populations, everything else. That's a gargantuan undertaking, but we have the data and we have the technology to consolidate and create these massive databases and massively complex models. I've done some of that work myself. For CEMEX, I headed up a project where I first conceived of a system that could simultaneously optimize for the production of cement at their dozens of plants throughout the world, and the distribution of that cement from those plants to the thousands of different markets around the world, leveraging all the modes of transport, rail, steamship, truck, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a huge network orchestration optimization problem, and I actually had to develop some new technology to be able to do that, and it worked, and it worked like a charm, right? So that was actually the inspiration for how we could take that and scale it up and scale it up. That was several years ago, and technology has evolved so much since then that we're now actually at a point that we can leverage that technology and create a complete comprehensive model of the entire global economy. And then, with that model, think of it like SimWorld, kind of like SimCity, that software where you can simulate cities and create roads and bridges and factories and all kinds of stuff and model how the city is going to respond. Take that same paradigm but apply it to the entire planet, all of its people, and the entire global economy, right down to the corner shoe store. And with that model, then you can play with different what-if scenarios, right? And then if you build an optimization layer on top of that, artificial intelligence can be leveraged to zero in on, the optimal solution. Well, what is the optimal? Well, the optimal solution is that trajectory which takes us as quickly as possible to the ideal state of planet Earth and humanity, which is certainly not so much a technical conversation as it is, a philosophical, moral, ethical one. What is the ideal state of planet Earth, right? Is it that everyone is fed and housed, or is it no? We're pretty much at the ideal state right now with a tenth of the people. Obviously not. I'm giving an extreme example to make a point, which is that there's a huge range of dimensions across which we could be exploring this. And in fact, the name spectral radius was chosen because in layman's terms, it's a mathematical expression. In layman's terms, it means essentially the maximum potential of a given system. So the objective of spectral radius is to maximize the potential of planet Earth. What does that mean? We got to have the conversation. So look for that topic for that. And I think we're over time on this video. So so we'll see you on the next topic.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dad.